Hello, folks. Welcome to the Two Stewards Show. My name's Mark. I'm here with Brent.
Hello, everybody.
That's, way to be on cue there, Brent. Thank you.
Yep.
And we have a guest again
No
this
delay
morning.
in this internet, is there?
Today. Yeah, the delay's with you, not the internet. Anyways.
Just throw me under the bus right away.
I get it right. I get it out of the way immediately. But thankfully, you don't have to listen to us bicker all morning. We have Jordan Bush with us. Welcome, Jordan.
Hey, thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, we're excited to be able to chat with you. So, Jordan, where do we know you from? You've put out the book, Thank God for Bitcoin.
Hey.
There we go. He's one of the little smiling faces on the back.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so I should say, especially for our listeners, because we tend to be very cautious using God's name. But you are in all sincerity saying, like, thank you, Lord, for Bitcoin, right?
Yeah. Basically, we wrote that book, and I will say this: when we wrote that, I was the only one of the 8 of us who was at the time in vocational Christian ministry, and the one book name that I was absolutely, as we were throwing out different ideas, that I was absolutely certain we were not going to use was "Thank God for Bitcoin." It's like that is the most cringe thing I've ever heard. And then over the course of like 2 or 3 months, the name just grew on me. And then I just was thinking, to your point, again, it sounds like you're being flippant, but at the end of the day, I'm like, well, the Bible says that every good and perfect gift is from above. And so without, trying to make some crazy claims, like if Bitcoin, money is a good gift, money, enables, humans to do things that nothing else, enables them to do things more efficiently than other things. And so if it's a good thing, we can't claim credit for it. And so if we can't claim credit for it, ultimately, what should we do? We should thank God. We should thank God for it. And so that's part of the way that we want to. Then you could also go to Romans 1, demonstrating the biblical bona fides of this idea. You go to Romans 1, and the Apostle Paul says that that the heart of sin, the core of sin, is to refuse to acknowledge God as God or be thankful. And so we definitely don't want to do that. So we're going to be thankful for Bitcoin as we're thankful for money more broadly, and for the ways in which God has ordained it to be used.
You've kind of pivoted away from kind of cringing at this name to now running an organization.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. Now we strategically go by TGFB for the sake of, like when we talk to people, we're like, because again, people who aren't Bitcoiners and don't know anything about the book, when they, again, to your point, when they hear the title, they're like,
yeah.
So yeah. But yes, I have come to embrace it.
Yeah. So, but it's not just the book, right? You have a whole organization centered around this. You've got a podcast.
Correct.
What else do you do, Jordan?
Yeah, so I host the Thank God for Bitcoin podcast. I also co-host the Thank God for Noster podcast. If you listeners are listening and you thought to yourself, man, Bitcoin is niche. You ain't seen nothing yet. Noster is even more niche. Noster is like a decentralized social media protocol, or decentralized internet protocol that is primarily used for.
There's a few listeners, like a couple listeners for that one, or.
You'd actually be surprised.
Yeah.
We I think by far we've had bigger episodes of that than Thank God for Bitcoin. I think we've had at least one episode that had over 7,500 downloads, including just some of the most well-known people in the whole Noster space listen to that podcast. We are the longest running. We're the Noster podcast with the most episodes. So we get all kinds of interesting people, and some more well-known people too, who listen to it, which I had zero expectation for.
Wow.
But my co-host John is a Christian and a Noster developer, and so I host that one. I also we're just talking. I just getting ready to hit send on another book called The Gospel According to Bitcoin, and that book, whereas Thank God for Bitcoin is written to kind of help. Designed to help Christians make sense of Bitcoin. The Gospel According to Bitcoin is designed to help Bitcoiners make sense of Christianity. And so I was a church planter and pastor and church planter in Uruguay for a number of years. And so that missionary heart is very much still there, even though that's not what I'm doing vocationally at this point. And so we wrote that book. Also wrote a kids book that we hope to publish later this year called The Orange Umbrella. We do all kinds of stuff. So, and then obviously the conference is our big, in terms of, raising money for organization. We do a conference, we bring in speakers, we sell tickets and all that kind of stuff. So that's the short version of, of what we're doing.
I have a question. So why do you think it is so important for Christians to know about Bitcoin? Because it seems like you've kind of pivoted. I don't know if you were in church branding and then you came across Bitcoin or how that worked, your story, but you dedicate a lot of your time and efforts to kind of spreading Bitcoin message and now spreading the gospel message to Bitcoiners. So
correct. Yeah. And so a big part of that, again, that seems like the weirdest thing. And there's a number of reasons why that didn't happen. We could define negatively, but I'll define it positively. So we were missionaries. I was a church planting pastor in Uruguay. And so, over the course of a number of years, we helped found a Reformed Baptist church. And so, we're ministering to people in Uruguay. Half of our church were Venezuelan immigrants. So we did not anticipate that being a substantive group of, the number of the people who we were going to be ministering to. And so, once we get there, I'm starting to try to figure out, like, why are there so many Venezuelans pouring into Uruguay? And you're talking tens of thousands of Venezuelans pouring into Uruguay over the course of a few years. And so we just was trying to figure out why that was, and came to find out that the reason was because the government of Venezuela had hyperinflated their currency. And this had resulted in people, some of whom were doctors, economists, people who in many cases were making, over six figures a year in dollar terms in Venezuela, who a few years later weren't able to pay the rent in Uruguay. And so just absolute economic devastation. And so as we're, doing counseling and discipleship and just helping them pick up the pieces of their life in Uruguay, in the back of my mind, I was a philosophy major in college. You can ask my parents. Asking why has been, something that's driven me for a long time. And so I just was trying to figure out, like, why is this happening? And so that was going on kind of passively. And then a few years later, when I got into Bitcoin, again, started looking at Bitcoin through, this critical lens and just trying to understand what it was. I saw the number, the dollar denominated number flying up and down on the screen. And I just was like, I have no framework for how to think about what this is. And
when that have been? Just like what year kind of?
This would have been 2019. It was, I had bought a little bit of Bitcoin in the crazy bull run up, late 2017, but it wasn't principled at all. I just had heard about it on Twitter. And so I bought, $100 worth or something. But and it was in 2019, once Bitcoin came back to life a little bit, that I was just like, wait a second, what is this thing? And so it was through, that year in 2019, I really started studying it, that I realized, man, Bitcoin was created literally to solve this exact issue that our Venezuelan brothers and sisters are dealing with. And so in addition to that happening, I was also, the Venezuelans are the most, looking at what happened to our Venezuelan brothers and sisters was, the latest stage of what happens with fiat currencies. They collapse and result in hyperinflation and all kinds of stuff. But what I found out was that every currency in Latin America and in many currencies around the world had experienced hyperinflationary events and had seen their currencies collapse. And so within Latin America alone, about every 13, 14 years, there's a currency collapse in Latin America. And so I just started to look around and see the effects that had on normal people, but especially on ministries. And so again, I started to look around and see there'd been church planters, tons of churches that have been planted in Uruguay, in the last 50 years, but many of them were still very weak. Because again, imagine if you're a church planter, you go down there, you do all kinds of good missionary work. There's people who've invested to send you there, and you start planting a church, and you start growing the church a little bit. But over time, imagine you start saving for a building. You start saving up so you can be paid full time to work full time as a pastor, and then 10 years later, you've got $100,000 saved in the bank. You've been denying yourself. Your people have been generous. And then your currency collapses. And all that money, if you're denominating it in that local currency, becomes
nothing
worthless.
Nothing you can do at that point.
Nothing you can do. And so that was kind of the real clicking point for me was, man, like this is part of the reason why, the church, again, there are strong churches in Uruguay, but many of the churches that we knew were smaller and weak, and they just couldn't get ahead because they couldn't outpace, the currency devaluation that was going on. And then I looked around and saw, my own life as I'm looking. I grew up in a Christian family, went to Christian school, did go to public school for some period of time, but went to a Christian university. I had a stay-at-home mom. She stayed home with us. And so I've been able to reap the benefit of, having, and we had the reserve currency of the world for the last, 100 years. So we basically, I had a lot of privileges that, as I was looking around, many people in Uruguay just didn't have the luxury of, and especially in Venezuela. And so I just started to see the very practical ways in which something as seemingly unspiritual as monetary devaluation had real consequences on ministry and in the lives of normal people. And so then when I started to understand Bitcoin, I got connected right as the pandemic was beginning, about a year after I had, really started in 2019. So early 2020, I got invited to join this book club. And some of the other, like Jimmy Song was in there, Robert Breedlove, some other really well-known people within the Bitcoin world. Were in that, and so I joined the group, and we read a couple
book club where you read books or you write books.
Correct. We read books. Okay. I had zero ambition to write a book, but we ended up reading a book called "The Ethics of Money Production" by Jorg, Guido, Hulsmann, which is a fantastic book. It's a little bit tougher of a read, a little bit more, I would say like college level. But again, anybody who's into reading is going to enjoy it. And it just talks about the ethics of money production.
Is that the fellow who's going to be at the conference?
Correct. I could not believe that he was willing to come. I was so thrilled. Because his book is fantastic, had a really big impact on all of us. So we read that book, and then we also read a book. He's a Roman Catholic Austrian economist. So we read that book, and then the other book we read was by a Protestant Christian Reconstructionist named Gary North. We read a book called Honest Money by him that's designed to be a popular level introduction to again, the ethics of money production. What is it? The fact that it's not just what you do with money that can be moral or immoral. How the money is created can also happen immorally or morally. And so we, read both those books, thought that it was really interesting. I never thought about this topic at all. And so we finished that. 2 weeks went by. I thought to myself, well, that was the weirdest thing I've ever done. A bunch of Christians who were Bitcoiners and we're reading these books. This is wild. And 2 weeks later, one of the other guys who was in the book club reached out and said, hey man, like basically long story short, we appreciated your contribution to the book club. We're going to write our own book based on, these two books, because the payoff of those two books, both of them, is we need to go back to the gold standard. And again, I don't have any problem with gold. I think like gold's great. I think even just pragmatically, I think gold's going to do well over the long term. But basically, we just were, convinced of the superiority in certain ways of Bitcoin over gold, and just the path forward to going back to a gold standard versus, something like Bitcoin. We just basically saw, hey, this is surprisingly like there's a lot of things that, commend themselves to Bitcoin. So long story short, we ended up writing Thank God for Bitcoin. And we are Protestants here. So I jokingly tell everybody we wrote the book in about 6 months, and then we got to experience every Protestant's dream, which was our book. Coincidentally, we didn't mean it, but it came out the same week as a book by the Pope, and we were outselling the Pope. We said, "Take that, Bishop of Rome! We're out here coming for you." But yeah, so we got to do that, and so then. Yeah, in the aftermath, the
what was the Pope's book called?
I don't remember. Neither does anybody else. No, I'm just kidding. I honestly don't know. I can't remember. I did know at one time, but yeah. And again, I'm sure it's done really well since then. But in at least that first period, we were outselling. And so yeah, and then just the response to the book, surpassed anything we had the slightest expectation. I think we got a real report the other day. I think we sold like 45,000 copies of that book. And so there's just been a lot of people who were interested in it, and it was the first kind of thing touching on the Christian and Bitcoin worlds. And there's just tons of Christians out there. There's just tons of Christians out there who are interested in this kind of stuff. And so really around that time, same time this was all happening, we were kind of transitioning out of Uruguay. We hadn't taken a furlough in 7 years. And then on top of that, I was thinking, coming to the conclusion that I was Presbyterian. And so I'm like, all of our Baptist supporters and all of the Baptist churches that are supporting us probably going to be less than thrilled with that development. And so I just realized, man, we're kind of moving into a different phase of ministry. And so we came back to the States. And so then as we came back, we were home for a few months. I started talking with Jimmy and Robert and some of these other guys who were authors of the book. And they just basically said, hey, if you want to do this full time, if you want to, while you're trying to figure out theologically where you're at, like we'd be willing to fund you to do Thank God for Bitcoin stuff full time. And so that's what I've done for the last year and a half.
Wow. That's awesome.
Wow.
So that's the not so short version, but
short enough.
Yeah.
No, it's interesting. You talking about Central and Latin America, or Central and South America, and the currency collapses. And then talking about the ethics of money production. I mean, I think you can make the argument that it is the way that money is produced and the fact that the U.S. has the central reserve currency that really leads to most of these other currencies collapsing, right?
Correct.
Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, it's definitely. So, there's plenty of blame to go around. Well, why blame one when you can just blame everyone? But yeah, I mean, certainly, the United States became the world reserve currency in the aftermath of World War II. You had basically Europe, the countries in Europe, to survive, spent the vast majority of their gold reserves paying countries that were outside of the theater of war. In as far as I'm concerned, the two that were most impacted by this were the United States. Obviously, have good geographic isolation. I don't know if Canada helped. I'm sure I don't know my Canadian World War II history, but then the other country who had their heyday in this time was Uruguay. Uruguay also pretty geographically isolated from the war. And so Uruguay is one of the largest beef producers in the world, definitely per capita. And so they had sent tons of canned meat to the European theater to help with the war effort. And so in the aftermath of that, Europe didn't have very much gold. And so they weren't going to have, gold as their reserve. And so they said, all right, what else can we use as our reserve currency? And so the United States and a bunch of other countries, gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in 1944 to have this discussion of what the next reserve currency was going to be. And the United States was the 900-pound gorilla in the room that had tons of leverage. They had tons of gold, and and they just were huge, and had by some accounts saved everybody's bacon. And so they just basically said, all right, we think we should use our currency as the as the reserve currency. And everyone was like, okay, we'll do that. And so, the United States had this position, it was called the exorbitant privilege of being the only country that could legally, print the world reserve currency. And so what they did was the United States said to these countries around the world, you guys hold dollar reserves, we'll hold gold reserves. We'll peg the ratio of gold to dollars at a certain number, certain percentage, and then you guys can recreate your own paper currencies, denominated according to those ratios. And then the safeguard for this process was you guys can always at any point convert some of those dollar reserves for gold. So that was kind of the check on the system. It was like this daisy chain that tried to provide some security against the United States just wantonly printing more dollars. And so that's how that system stayed in place from 1944 to 1971. In 1971, the French came to the United States and they said, we want to convert some of our reserves from dollars to gold. And so they did that.
Some or all?
I think it was just some at that point.
Okay.
And the very next day, President Nixon came out and said the United States is stopping the convertibility of dollars for gold. And so it was at that point that effectively the United States declared bankruptcy because they basically confessed to the fact that they did not have enough gold reserves to account for all of the dollars that were out there. And so what this effectively meant is that the United States had been, secretly printing dollars and more than they had this ratio to bear out. They've been printing dollars to, do things like fight the Cold War and do all kinds of other things. And so what this meant was that everyone who had dollar reserves, every nation that had dollar reserves was now thrown into chaos because there was no scarce asset backing up their currencies, even indirectly. And so this is, what this basically was. It meant that every national currency became as secure and as sound as its government was fiscally responsible. Which, if you know anything about government, means not very.
Like if you can trust the government.
Correct. And so what is the nature of democracy, especially, this was especially problematic because in democracies, you have a revolving door of new leaders coming in, and how do those leaders come to power? Many times it's by promising more free stuff than the last guy. And so the way that they, frequently governments, especially in this day and age, pay for stuff is to print more money. They take on more debt and create more money. And so over time that has the effect of inflation and currency devaluation. So those are some of the reasons and the effects and the way that it, kind of affects us as, a lot, corporately and then individually as well.
Did you see all this stuff before you got into Bitcoin, or?
I did not. I had no clue. I mean, it's not that I just had zero interest. I didn't see the connection to normal life and why it mattered. And, but yeah, so that was part of my Bitcoin process was learning.
Okay. And then you said, sorry, Mark, but you said, you said Bitcoin is superior to gold. Why exactly would you say that?
It does sound insane, right? Like that it sounds thoroughly insane, especially you're like, somebody at this point's thinking these
gold's been around for thousands of years, they use it, and then you come along and you're like, I found this thing out and it's superior. Like,
100%. And so again, some people are sitting there thinking these guys are getting ready to drink Kool-Aid. They probably have black Nikes on, they've drunk the Bitcoin Kool-Aid. And so I think that again, first thing I would say is the value is relative. Under the sun of non-divine image bearing things under the sun, the value of things is relative. And so again, the value of especially a money depends on the circumstances, right? So in the case of gold and silver, I'll use the situation of our Venezuelan brothers and sisters as an example. So and this is increasingly, there's hundreds of millions of people who are increasingly in this situation because of failing currencies. They're being forced to leave their homes and walk or take planes or buses, whatever it is, away from those areas to try to find places where they can make money and then send it home to family. So in the case of our Venezuelan brothers and sisters, many of them had to walk across the border from Venezuela into Colombia or to other countries. And so for them, the physicality of gold actually became a huge problem, a huge liability, gold and silver. So they would walk across the border. There were people who knew that there were mass amounts of people leaving the country with valuable goods. And so there were people waiting to try to rob them. There were soldiers sitting on the border waiting to try to, basically extract value from them, forcing them to bribe them to do things. And so this is one of the limitations of gold is its physicality, depending on your circumstance. Another downside of gold is it tends to centralize. Gold tends to centralize in banks. Nobody wants to, use. They don't want to use gold. It's very difficult to use gold, especially for smaller purchases. And so, if you're going to pay for things, even moderately sized things in silver, you're talking about or moderately priced things in silver. You're talking about large amounts of silver, walking around carrying silver, or you're carrying gold. And so, again, it just makes you, a target. It can be heavy. And then, but even more, the process is the tendency is for when gold and silver is involved and you get banks involved, the story of why we went away from gold is that just basically it was more convenient to use something like paper currency. It's lighter, easier to hide, all kinds of stuff. You can create different denominations. You can have $100 bill that weighs just as much as a dollar bill, and so there's just a number of ways in which gold was inconvenient. Another way is just like the production cost of gold. This is both feature and bug. Basically you have to go find it. And so if your country doesn't have good gold reserves, then you're going to be at a disadvantage compared to some other places. So again, this is not like a wholesale condemnation of gold by any means. I think gold is tremendously valuable for a lot of the reasons that I think Bitcoin is valuable. And we can get into those here in a minute.
Yeah. So you say like those are the things that kind of point to gold's inferiority, but how would you say like Bitcoin is superior then? Because like it doesn't have those limitations, or there's other things about it that might be more attractive, or?
Correct. And so what I would say is there's other situations in which Bitcoin is valuable. Bitcoin, to the same point, Bitcoin is not ultimately, it's not in 100% of the situations. It's not. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't advocate that people ape in with 100% of their wealth into Bitcoin. That's kind of what I'm saying is you should have multiple. You should think about it like insurance with your long-term savings, and have exposure to a number of different things.
Well, that example that you gave about, these people from Venezuela coming out of the country and they have gold and they're getting, that gold confiscated at the border or stolen. How would Bitcoin, have you seen Bitcoin perform better in that situation? Thinking.
Yeah. And that sounds crazy, right? You're like, yeah. The other thing would be you have to verify with gold that it's actually gold, because there's plenty of examples, even on national levels where, there's fake gold, there's tungsten that's, wrapped in gold and all kinds of stuff. And so like, there's just downsides to being able to verify that the thing you're actually looking at is totally gold. You'd have to melt it down or do some like X-raying and, there's limitations with Bitcoin in that specific case of Venezuelans crossing the border. Again, I'm sure this has happened. I don't know personally people who've done this, but at least the ability exists for Venezuelans or anybody else they can sell their local currency, sell their local goods for Bitcoin, memorize a 12-word seed phrase or write it down, tattoo it. Like you can do a bunch of different things, and you can take that information anywhere in the world, get to where you're going, plug those 12 or 24 words into a wallet app on your phone, and boom, Bob's your uncle. You've got your money, and you can start over your life. And so this is again this requires understanding and putting time in to understand it. But it is actually an incredibly strategic tool, especially for the moment that we're in. It's very beneficial and helpful in that way. The other thing would be, and this isn't so much a weakness. This is like a designed. This is just a difference in the nature of the two things. So let's say tomorrow, every Christian, because scarcity is what we're aiming at. Scarcity is the thing that Christians should care about in money. And so, because again, why is that? Because God made a scarce world. God made us to live in a world where we have to choose this or this. We can't have everything. We have to be, and this is what it means to be a steward, right? To the name of your podcast. A steward is I take this scarce thing that I have, and I allocate it with wisdom, because I don't have an unlimited amount of it. And so Bitcoin, just like gold, is scarce. There's only 21 million Bitcoin. But the interesting thing, one of the interesting differences is that if tomorrow all of the Christians in the world said, you know what, we wake up from our fiat fueled fever dream and we say, this is wrong. We should recognize and submit ourselves to scarce money, the principle of scarcity. In the same way that we wouldn't take unlimited wives, we shouldn't have money that can be created, limitlessly. We're going to use something like gold. You'd have overnight this boom in the demand for gold. The price of gold would go crazy. But due to the nature of the fact that there's still tons of gold out there in the world, and the higher that gold's price gets, the more that it incentivizes, finding more of that gold. So basically, at some point, you're going to reach like a point of equilibrium as supply rises to meet, or as demand rises to meet supply, and vice versa. With Bitcoin, the interesting thing is, so by there being this point where this equilibrium gets met. This can basically it can basically cap the blow off top potential of something like gold and silver. And so it allows governments effectively to get their arms around gold and silver and to basically co-opt it from being as valuable as it could be. They use things like the futures market. They do all kinds of different things to try to suppress the value of gold. I think over the long term, that's going to fail. And so this is why, again, I think gold's going to be very valuable and do well denominated in fiat terms. But with Bitcoin, things are a little different, because with Bitcoin, there is a fixed finite amount of Bitcoin that will ever exist. And the last Bitcoin will be mined in the year 2140. And so if let's say we repeated that same thought experiment, tomorrow, every single Christian wakes up from their fever dream and goes, thank God for Bitcoin. We're going to, we're going to go into Bitcoin. You'd have this crisis point where the price of Bitcoin would absolutely explode, because there is a 100% fixed amount out there. And there's even less than that that's liquid on exchanges. And so you could easily see if that happened, like if you doubled the amount of people who are into Bitcoin, you could easily see $1 million Bitcoin within not very much time, just because of how little liquid Bitcoin there is out there in the world. And so this is a difference. And again, you might be thinking to yourself, well, the volatility of Bitcoin is a problem. And it's like, it depends again on, we can ask the question, by what standard, in what circumstances is that a problem? And so there's obviously, volatility. We think about volatility like it's totally negative, but I want one of the most helpful frameworks for thinking about money more broadly and thinking about Bitcoin is thinking about people. And think about children. Okay. When children are born, children are incredibly volatile. Very volatile emotionally, physically. The amount of physical change and physical growth that happens with children is staggering. I mean, you're talking within years they're doubling and tripling in height in the matter. They're basically definitely doubling within a matter of a few years. And so the vast majority of your growth on so many fronts physically happens when you're a child. And so this volatility is actually the price of life. Like, living things are more volatile than dead things. Dead things are absolutely stable. And so with Bitcoin, part of the reason why it's so volatile is because it's growing like crazy. It's literally been growing exponentially in terms of the amount of capital flowing into it and the number of people that are using it. For the last 15 years, it's been growing exponentially. And so again, volatility is a part of the price of that happening. And it's actually an indication of tremendous life and growth rather than some inherent flaw with Bitcoin itself. So those would be two of a number of the differences that I think, again, they inhibit people from thinking about Bitcoin in ways that I think are more helpful and representative of what's the dynamics actually affecting Bitcoin's volatility.
Man.
Yeah. And I took a few notes here. Well, a lot of people point to 1971, right, as that sort of watershed moment.
Yeah.
I like to look back to 1913, actually.
Yep.
Right, the introduction of the Fed Reserve.
Correct.
Because that's when it sort of was centralized, right, that power. And we talked a little bit beforehand about some of our beliefs, and one of our beliefs is the depravity of man. And if we can corrupt something, we're going to. And best of intentions maybe with the Fed. I don't even believe that.
I was going to say I don't believe that,
but you can make an argument, I guess. But you could see how it, even with a gold standard, it started to be corrupted because, even, 1971, that was just the acknowledgement that, we're like when you go bankrupt, right? You're in trouble long beforehand. Yep. And at some point you formally state it. But that's all 1971 was, right? Like just that acknowledgement. And so, even you talked about the price of gold. It is manipulated clearly. It's suppressed. And as Christians, what can we use that is not subject to that? And so that's one of the things I've been thinking about a lot too, is how can we screw up Bitcoin? If we went to a Bitcoin standard, what could we do? Like, would we just do the same stuff? Would we have Bitcoin futures and, derivatives and all this kind of stuff? Like, I could see, I think George Gammon was sort of on that track, debating with Jeff Booth as well. Like, okay, we can go to a standard, but we'll still, and, so I'm not sure where I am on that. I still think you can still have the rich and the poor, but it's going to be a much less currency or money that is much less subject to manipulation. Yeah, so I don't know if you've, what does the world look like in a Bitcoin standard?
Yeah, again, this is not some panacea. Like, Bitcoin's not going to. There's a phrase in Bitcoin that goes, "Bitcoin fixes this." I believe, Bitcoin fixes a lot of things, but it's not going to fix human depravity. It's not going to make people, it's not going to make people, love each other overnight. It's not going to make people not be scammers, some percentage of the population. But again, one of the things when I talk about Bitcoin is law. Like, Bitcoin is law. And so in the same way that, the same way that, what function did the law serve? Well, it points us to Christ. That's number one. If we're talking about the Mosaic law, but like, law is it's this rigid thing. It can be this rigid thing. God didn't make it to be like this completely rigid thing. But basically it defines lines. It basically defines what, defines the territory that you're living in. And so one of the downsides of Bitcoin is just how, like, unforgiving it is. Like, you can use Bitcoin, and there's been lots of people who, they've been scammed out of their Bitcoin because they sent Bitcoin to someone who pretended to be someone that was trustworthy and they weren't. And when that happens, like, it's very difficult to get your Bitcoin back. They can, the possibility exists if they find the person and can get access to them, and then they can, make them send the money back. Police can, or whatever, but it certainly isn't anywhere near a guarantee. And so it's absolute and unforgiving in that sense. That's, again, both feature and bug. There's reasons why people love that. There's reasons why good, honest people should love that. And there's reasons why, why that's can be difficult as well. So why would that be? I mean, that seems like a pretty bad example. Like, why would you want something like that? Well, if I'm sending money to a church planter who's in Russia, I don't need any. There's no third party. There's no counterparty who I'm having to go through and get permission from to send money to them. Well, that's a pretty valuable thing for Christians who have been sent out by the Lord to make disciples of all nations, irrespective of whether or not there are sanctions on those countries. So the question is, how are we gonna get money to places like Russia, places like the Middle East, to plant churches? Well, Bitcoin's actually a really good tool in that regard. So again, there's all kinds of ways in which Bitcoin is a valuable thing. Of course, I mean, there already are futures. There's Bitcoin futures, but again, what happens is, because of the absolute scarcity of Bitcoin, it's a lot easier for those guys, for people who are messing around with derivatives and messing around with those kind of things, to get absolutely wrecked. And so that's part of what we saw with FTX. FTX was this giant hedge fund that had billions of dollars, at least nominally, and was sitting here giving out Super Bowl sponsorships in the United States to Steph Curry and Shaquille O'Neal and all these different guys. They had tons of money, and they actually had no Bitcoin on their reserves. They were totally lying. They were taking in customers' money and doing all kinds of crazy things with them, giving them to mostly Democratic politicians here in the United States. And so you had a lot of this stuff going on. These are total scammers. And so again, you're going to have the same kind of corruption within the dollar world, and it's not going to absolutely fix it. But there certainly is a cost. There's a cost to trying to play some of these games. And again, primarily this mechanism comes from, as long as people can take Bitcoin into their own custody, rather than leaving them with entities like FTX or on these exchanges. Effectively, you can think about it like, we can withdraw cash and have it in our possession, rather than just trusting banks. Because at least in the United States, I don't know how things are in Canada, there's been increasing numbers of banks that are failing. And so there's effectively, during those periods, there's runs on the bank. And if you're not one of those first people in line, there's a very good possibility that you're not going to get access to your money. Additionally, you have things like the Canadian trucker protest, where the government decides that you have opinions, whether politically or otherwise, religiously, whatever it might be. We're in a time and an age where governments are willing to debank their citizens for holding political opinions. I mean, you're talking things that we think about as being third world, dictator types things.
And
they're happening.
They have the willingness. They also have the power to do it too.
Correct.
Right? It's
100%.
easy for them to just push the button and there you go.
100%. And so I met and then interviewed BJ Dichter, who's the spokesperson for the Canadian trucker protest. And again, he's like, he goes, Bitcoin, the Bitcoin that we got sent was the only money that the government couldn't take away from us. And so I just think, again, as Christians, the more we have a double reason. Like BJ is not a Christian. BJ, he's not a Christian, and he obviously sees the value proposition just based on the political side of things alone. But as Christians and as churches, I'm like, we're getting to quickly entering a point where just for preaching a biblically faithful sermon on the Christian sexual ethic, you can. It's not hard at all to imagine a world in which you get your bank accounts taken away, you kicked out of, if you're renting, kicked out of certain building situations, where you're meeting, you're gathering. Again, we're just entering a different time, and so as a strategic asset like Bitcoin. Where again, it doesn't matter if you cancel me. I can custody my Bitcoin in such a way that I can still have access to it, no matter who, no matter who is telling me otherwise. I think it's strategically important for Christians to think about, even if you just want to think about missions, the missions angle, but especially even beyond that. I think we're, again, as we mentioned, within Canada, the United States. I mean, Australia. Good Lord, we don't even need to talk about Australia, but some of the things that we're experiencing over the last 4 years. I mean, I just think Bitcoin is this timely tool that is going to enable kingdom work to go forward, in the face of a lot of insanity.
So you've kind of given some practical things on Bitcoin for Christians, but just what about like the moral side of money? Because Bitcoin kind of proposes to be a monetary technology. You've written this book, it's the creation, corruption, and redemption of money. So I presume you're looking at, monetary technologies that are out there, what you mentioned, kind of how gold could be corrupted, how Bitcoin, it might have options to avoid some of these corruptions. But how do you look at the morality of money? Like, do you have some Bible passages or some context there for people?
All right. Now, ready? This sounds insane. You're like, it sounds crazy. You're like, what? So ethics of money production. What in the world does that have to do with anything? Well, again, so the kind of the turning point for me in understanding this, I was a pastor in Uruguay. I was doing sermon prep one day, and I was in the book of Galatians, and then I believe it's Galatians 6. It's near the end of the letter. The Apostle Paul says, he's talking to them, talking to the Galatians. He says, God is not mocked, for what a man sows, that will he also reap. And so I started thinking about that. I was like, man, like what is, I was trying to rephrase it and, put in other words and just to try to understand it better. And I was like, okay, what does this mean? God is not mocked, for what a man sows, he will also reap. So I just rephrased it. And I said, all right, God says that sowing and reaping, this principle of sowing and reaping is so hardwired into the nature and fabric of the world that to deny it is tantamount to mocking God. And so I just started to try to think of like, what are some other examples of this that maybe aren't just called sowing and reaping? What's an example of this? And I thought of Thessalonians, where Paul says, if one is not willing to work, then neither should he eat. And so Paul is saying there's supposed to be a sowing and reaping relationship between working and eating. If you're not willing to work, then neither should you eat. And so think about the logic of that. What happens if you don't work for long enough? You won't eat for long enough. And what will happen?
Yeah.
You'll die. And so Paul is basically saying, if you're not willing to work, because the purpose of food is to give you energy to serve, give you energy to work. If you're not willing to work, then you should just die. Like this is the, if you follow the logic to its logical conclusion, that's what he's saying. And then you think about other things like this follows everywhere. God has ways and God has means. So something like human sexuality. Okay. Like God has an order for things. You sow marriage, and then you reap things as a consequence. You reap sex and you reap childbearing. God has an order for those things. Those things, we're not to do those things out of order. There's supposed to be a production cost to children. There's supposed to be a production cost to sex, like marriage, married relations.
God's beautiful design, right?
Correct. And so part of the way, and so this is what really hit me. You could go down. There's 100 things. Logic itself is founded on sowing and reaping. If this, then this. You can't reverse that without affecting this. So sowing and reaping is everywhere. God will render to each one according to his works. You work, and then God renders to you according to your works. Why couldn't God? What is the difference between Christianity and Islam? In Islam, they don't understand why Jesus had to die on the cross. They said that wasn't necessary. Allah can just forgive sins. He can just fiatly, papally declare forgiveness. And within Christianity, that doesn't work. Like, you have to have someone pay the cost of sin. Sin has, again, you've sowed sin. There has to be a consequence and a payment for it. And so this is all throughout. If you think about, just about anything, now that I've seeded, now that I've sown this seed, hopefully as you read the scriptures, think about sowing and reaping, and you're going to find it everywhere. It's all over the place. And so the thing that, in addition to the Galatians passage, that we go back to the, you go back to the Romans 1 passage where he says, the nature, the seed form of sin is a refusal to acknowledge God as God or be thankful. And so the nature of sin is a refusal to acknowledge the world that God has made, and an insistence on trying to create our own reality, build our own reality on top of or in place of what God has done. And
that's the mocking God, right?
Correct.
Kind of a slap in the face of God.
Correct. And so we see this all over the place right now. We see people trying to shove aside God's reality and create their own realities in place of it. And so this could happen on gender fronts. This could happen on marriage fronts. There's like a shifting definition of what marriage is, shifting definitions of what are some of these other ones? Of what government is. Basically we're at a point where I said this a number of times. We're in a point of definitional crisis. No one knows what anything is because we've rejected the possibility. Many people rejected the possibility of an objective standard by which to determine things. And so again, you can choose to do that. You can choose you can make choices. You can't choose your consequences. There are natural consequences that flow from those rejections. And so the consequence is that we end up in a world where it looks like absolute clown world. You have full-grown men identifying as little girls, and people are actually applauding them and taking that seriously. You have governments who are running up, just trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars worth of deficit, and just basically acting like that's fine. And so this is the problem with money. It's just as much a problem with the creation of money as it would be anywhere else. Monetary creation has just as much moral. There's just as many moral issues involved as the creation of humans. So for the same reason as it would be immoral to go around and wantonly have 100 children with any woman who you can deceive into laying with you, multiplying. God's money, people who bear God's image, is just as big a problem. It's just as big of a problem to multiply money that bears the image of mankind. To borrow from the story where Jesus is asked, they held up the denarius, whose image and whose likeness and description is this? And Jesus says, "Give to Caesar what's Caesar's, and give to God what's God's." Jesus is drawing a comparison between the logic of money and the logic of the relationship between human money and people, and the logic between people and God. They both bear the image of their creator. And so you can't deny, if you deny that, then that's every bit as much of a problem in the case of human money as it is if we were to try to deny that we're created in God's image. And so again, what does this practically look like? Well, this looks like, what would an honest money or a moral money look like? Well, it would look like a money that submits itself to the principles that God made to govern the world, namely the principle of sowing and reaping. We don't live in a world with unlimited resources. We live in a world with scarce resources. And so we need to make choices that when we need to submit ourselves, submit our monetary units to that reality as much as we do that in any other sphere of life. And so practically, there's a reason why gold and silver was used for a long time, because gold is a scarce resource. Gold has a production cost. Gold as money requires production. You have to pay people to dig it out of the ground. You have to pay people to refine it. You have to buy the tools to do so. All these kind of things. There's a fixed production cost of gold and silver, and that forces governments to actually submit themselves to a greater authority than just their own opinions, their own desires. And so historically, that's been something that has enabled, it's been one of the checks on limitless war, is that one of the sides of the war would run out of money. Functionally, in the last 100 years, especially the last 50 years, you've seen much longer, large-scale wars that have done untold damage denominated in human lives, as well as the money that it took. And they've been able to do this because they functionally have unlimited money to fund them with.
Yeah, they're going to run out of runway eventually.
Correct. Yeah, God is not mocked. Eventually, the bill's gonna come due.
Yeah, because you said like God's reality, right? That is reality. There is no other one.
There's no other game in town.
Yeah.
But what fiat money allows you to do is it basically enables these governments and central banks to extend the distance between sowing and reaping to the point where people basically think that they've avoided it. Governments can fool themselves into thinking that we've escaped. They've drank their own Kool-Aid. I don't talk about Kool-Aid this much. This is our second Kool-Aid reference in this episode.
Well, they're going to be out of office in 4 years. So as long as the runway hits 4 years or whatever, they're good.
And this is 100%. This is 100%, Brent. Fantastic point. This is one of the problems. Again, there's obviously benefits to democracy, but this is one of the real big downsides. Is that over the long term, you have shorter and shorter. Unless you have a moral people, which is what, the founders of at least the United States said was required for a republic to work effectively, you need a moral people. And when you reject morality, reject an objective basis for morality, it's not going to be long before you turn into, an absolute clown world like the one we live in.
Oh man.
Yeah.
One thing that popped in my head, sorry, Mark, again, but you mentioned boundaries give freedom, right? Like
Correct.
You have these limitations, and I think people think limitations are a bad thing.
Correct.
You see when you take away the limitations, all the chaos that ensues, right?
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. This is, where does freedom come from? And this is where Christians, we can help here, right? We live in a world, you have Nike telling us to just do it. We have this ethos of overcome your limits. Just say, don't listen to the haters who try to put boundaries on what you can do. We have these messages that are just, we're bombarded with them all the time. And yet, to borrow from, I believe this is Tim Keller. Tim Keller, again, I have differences with Tim Keller, but this is one thing in which he's articulated this fantastically, is that freedom is not the absence of limits. It's submission to the right limits, to limits that correspond with your nature. So the fish who says, I'm going to be free of this oppressive water, and he leaps out of the water onto the bank, is going to quickly find that he misunderstood freedom. And so, freedom is found within the presence of the right restrictions. And so this is as true in, monetary terms and as, with money as it is any other thing. If we deny sleep, then you're going to be hurting over the course of, a number of years. If you deny that, there's any relationship, if you just believe that nutrition is a white supremacist lie, a white capitalist lie designed to, foster these
cornflakes.
Exactly, designed to foster these, help the expansion of these large multinational food companies. You're going to quickly find that is not true. God has created certain nutritional realities that we either submit to or are crushed by. I think this is a big thing that Christians recognize, that it's not just autonomy. Freedom is not autonomy. Freedom is submitting yourself to reality, and we would understand that obviously to be the world.
You submit to God's reality,
to God's
and you
design.
reap His benefits.
Man, you're taking shots everywhere, Jordan. You're going to get us banned on. You're going to get us prosecuted.
Goal.
So
that's my goal.
In Canada, we actually have some laws where if you speak out about certain things, transgender issues for that's could be a criminal offense, right? Hate speech. That's something we've kind of wrestled too with our churches. Like, how do we try to protect our pastors? And you know, we do what we can, but at the end of the day, you got to speak the truth, and you know, whatever happens. I was just thinking when you were talking, I don't know, this is not totally related, but you know, the image of gold in the Bible and the refiner's fire, and how you know, gold has to be purified, and you clear the dross away, and there's work to be done there, right? And eventually the refiner can look in the gold and see his reflection. And just that sort of reflection of, you know, we're the reflection of God through that refining process. But we've certainly, in the production of money now, we've lost that, right? Like you said, it's just boom, out of thin air. But the other thing you're talking about is the idea that, we've, you know, once you lose objective truth, you know, which we have been working so hard on in the West for, you know, a couple centuries anyways. And now we've gotten to that point, right, where we're not just relativist. Like, there is some truth, but everything's relative to it. Like, it's gone. We're post-truth. And that sort of informs our money. But Bitcoiners are realizing that, like, no, there has to be an objective truth when it comes to money.
Correct.
Right? This whole fiat thing is terrible. It's a bad idea. And so, you know, we've been talking about this, like Brent and I, a little bit, and I've been thinking a lot about it, right? Like, we want to tell Christians about Bitcoin. It's one of the things we want to do. But we also want to tell Bitcoiners about Jesus. Like, you're on the right track. You know, we've drawn parallels sort of between the Reformation,
that's good.
You know, decentralizing, getting back to the truth, and then the advent of Bitcoin, and, you know, technology played a part. But, you know, you're a little bit further ahead, it sounds like, right? You've got, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about the gospel according to Bitcoin, but that is, I don't know, do you have any sneak peeks for us?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things, so again, the idea that, so the gospel according to Bitcoin is this book that a guy named Dan Sherman and I wrote. Dan actually lives in Toronto. He basically works for Power to Change, which is like a college, primarily a college ministry. So we wrote this book called The Gospel According to Bitcoin. Thank God for Bitcoin. When he wrote that, it was designed to help Christians understand the why of Bitcoin. We really only talk about Bitcoin itself in the last 2 chapters of the book. So it's far more an apologetic for sound money, and you know, a defense for that being something that Christians should care about, scarce money. The Gospel According to Bitcoin is designed to do the exact opposite, which is to explain Christianity to Bitcoiners. And again, one of the things that we see, and I've seen this, I mean, to an astounding degree, is that when people get into Bitcoin, like by having a healthy, again, by embracing scarcity, embracing a money that is scarce and you know is as scarce as everything else that God made, it really starts to flesh itself out in all kinds of surprising places. So you start to see people who are, I mean, just prior to getting involved in Bitcoin, who were, you know, radically individualist, radically just, you know, living just plugged into the normal ethos of things. They start to just think about everything, and they start to think about their health. They start to think about their food. They start to have like a lower time preference, which means they start to just think not in days or weeks. They start thinking in years and you know, even longer, generationally. And so they start, I mean, you have people who, you know, they start getting married and they start having kids, and they start, you know, opening themselves. They start to be more and more open to thinking about God and thinking about, I've seen, a number of people come to be Christians as a result of Bitcoin, which sounds insane. But it just it really does make sense if you follow the logic of what is actually going on in Bitcoin. If you take your eye, if you look under the hood, like, Bitcoin is just the wrapping. Like, if you look at the ideas that are underneath of Bitcoin, these ideas are far more ancient and more aligned with, you know, the actual things that undergird the world that God made than you might think. And so I think this has been it's been really interesting and surprising. But again, it's at the same time that it makes sense that the logic follows. Again, as an example, there's a number of different things we can do. So the book it's basically 21 meditations. So we did like some broad categories. We kind of followed the
you didn't
creation.
Want to do 21 million meditations.
Exactly.
So you just narrowed it down to 21.
That was going to take us a while to get to 21 million, but we started with 21. How do you eat an elephant? You eat it one bite at a time. So hopefully, we'll be on our way to 21 million meditations. But yeah, so we did 21, and the basic structure that we followed was, this idea, the same kind of the subtitle of Thank God for Bitcoin. So creation, corruption, redemption, and then we add another one of like, what is it? How do we live now? What does this look like to actually live this way? And so here's one example. Like this is just a basic one. There's all kinds that aren't this explicit, but there's all kinds of things within Bitcoin, within sound money that just point you to God, all right, and point you to God in interesting ways. So within Bitcoin, there's something called a child pays for parent transaction. Have you guys ever heard of one of those?
No.
Okay. So what can happen with when you send a Bitcoin transaction? You can basically you send, like, let's say I want to send 1 Bitcoin to Brent. He'll be very happy. I go to send Brent 1 Bitcoin, and I want to, let's say Brent doesn't care how fast he's going to get the Bitcoin. So I'm going to try to pay as little of a fee to do so as possible. With Bitcoin, they can already be super small. You can talking fractions of a percent for this fee. But let's say I wanted to send, I wanted to send it for 5 cents. I can send $1 billion for 5 cents, but I'll send Brent, I'll send Brent 1 Bitcoin for 5 cents. And let's just say, for whatever reason, during that same time, there was a huge influx in transactions. There's tons of other people who are trying to send transactions at the same time. Because there's a scarce amount of transactions that can take place on chain, there can be like a bottleneck, just like there's a traffic bottleneck when you're trying to get to work if there's an accident or something. And so what happens is if you don't pay enough of a fee at the beginning, and there's too many people who are paying a higher fee than you are over the course of a week or two or something like that, your transaction can just basically it's waiting to get confirmed, and it won't get lost. It doesn't get lost, but it can just basically not get included in a block for a long time until the fee environment drops down. And so one time this happened to me. I was sending a transaction. It was a few $100s, and I sent it for like the minimum fee possible. And so it went out, and I just, again, it was a couple $100, so I wasn't planning on using the money for a long time. And so I just, didn't look at it. I sent it. We were going somewhere, walked out the door. And so then a couple weeks later, I came back and I was, checked the destination wallet, the wallet where I sent the money to. And I checked it, and there was no Bitcoin there. I was like, wait, I broke Bitcoin. I was like, oh no, I broke Bitcoin. And so then I reasoned to myself, surely I'm not the first person to do this. And so I reached out to Jimmy. I have the ridiculous privilege of, being friends with Jimmy Song, who's got, 370,000 Twitter followers and has been in Bitcoin since 2011, contributed to, actually programmed on Bitcoin. Like, he's ridiculous. So I DM'd him and was like, or texted him and said, hey, Jimmy, I sent this Bitcoin. It didn't get there. And so him and then Lyle, I reached out to somebody else because I didn't completely trust Jimmy. And I reached out to Lyle Pratt, actually, who's one of the other authors of the book. And I said, what do I do? And they're like, oh, you just need to send a child pays for parent transaction. And I was like, oh, great. That's all great. And then I thought to myself, what's a child pays for parents? So they just basically said, okay, what you need to do is you send another transaction of the same amount. Okay. You just put the same amount. You use the same address. And when you send that second transaction with a higher fee, you include more of a fee. Once that gets included, it'll just knock through that first transaction. So you'll only end up sending one transaction, but it'll end up accomplishing it. The first transaction will get to where it's supposed to be. And so I did that. It worked perfectly. And as I was thinking about that, I just thought, that is the exact thing that happens in the gospel. Like, God creates people. He sends us out into the world to accomplish a purpose, he has a destination in mind for what he wants it to look like to be human. We literally fall short of that picture. We fall short of the glory of God. We don't end up where God wants us to be and to do what he wants us to do. And so how does God resolve that? He sends another. He sends another who will not fall short of the glory of God, who will arrive and be the end result of what he wants humanity to be. And by his arrival, by his not falling short, we reap the benefit of that. This is not a universalist thing. This is not what all parables break down. But just basically, that's the same logic of a child pays for parent transaction in Bitcoin is the logic of the gospel with Jesus. Like Jesus literally, he lives the life that we couldn't live. He dies the death that we should have died. And then we are able to reap the benefits that he, by faith, reap what he did for us. And so again, I said there, this just blew my mind. I'm like, what are the odds that this, that this same principle would exist in these two worlds? It's just so weird. So they're not all of the meditations in the book are like that, but that's one example. There's a bunch of things within money. I mean, Jesus talks about money almost as much or more as he talks about anything. And so we kind of try to learn from that. And we're like, all right, if Jesus found this to be one of his most helpful tools in explaining spiritual realities and realities of his kingdom, well then, why wouldn't, and if that's the case, and then if Bitcoin is money, it would make sense that you could also use Bitcoin to do, to make a lot of these same points. And as it turns out, you really can. Like without it being, cringe and weird. Like there, if people read the book, you'll see like it's not these cringe weird things.
So you're kind of in a unique position there to understand that.
Correct.
Too, right?
Yes.
As a Christian, right. Like a Bitcoiner reading this is not going to know, okay, that's like salvation.
Correct. So this is why, again, I don't look at myself in the truest sense as a Bitcoin missionary, but there's a real sense in which, the people who I'm around, like we're supposed to be a witness to whoever we're around. The people who I'm around more and more these days are Bitcoiners. And so, both of us are sitting here, like both Dan and I are I would say like evangelist type thing. Like we want to help explain the gospel in ways that help, especially people who are not Christians, understand it. And so both of us, have that desire and yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure when you went to Uruguay, you learned to speak Spanish, right?
Correct.
Or, if you didn't before, you figured it out.
Yep.
And, you speak the language of the people that you're ministering to. And I think that's a beautiful example right there. People outside Bitcoin might not get that, but someone who's interested in it for sure would. And it's much more impactful.
Correct.
As well, right?
Yeah.
When you frame it that way.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's the thing. Again, I've seen numerous people who, again, by coming into Bitcoin, they're complete atheists. They get into Bitcoin. They start asking these fundamental questions of, just basic, basic questions about, who am I? How do I know? Because again, this is the thing is we assume we think that we understand money. Everyone thinks that they understand money. But then the thing that more and more of us have found is that when you get right down into it, we've had a whole lot of intuition. Our entire framework for what we thought about money was built on intuition. It wasn't explicitly told to us. It's all, implicitly taken from living in the world. But when you get right down to asking the questions of like, what is money and how do you know? At the end of the day, like the thing that more and more people find is, man, I really don't have a really good basis for understanding this, or I've never taken the time to actually think about, systematically process through these things. And then by seeing just the huge impact that something like money has on their life, it touches so many things within our human experience. The fact that they could be wrong, the fact that people could be so wrong and ignorant of this one giant aspect of life, it opens them up to the potentiality of, are there other parts of my life that I've been taking for granted that I understand that maybe I'm just completely, I just don't understand at all. And I really think that's part of what, I've heard people say this, that's part of the reason why they're open to religion. They're like, all right, well, if I was so blind and so wrong to this thing, maybe I should give, religion, another glance. Maybe I should, think about it now that I see this thing differently.
And like they go down this rabbit hole of Bitcoin and they discover that Bitcoin's kind of the solution, I guess, in the temporal world, like in this world, right? But then the Bible's the solution for eternity. Yep. So it's the eternal solution. And,
correct.
They need to make that jump, but
yeah. And so again, you're like basically, sound money takes, it really values people's time, right? It's money that is as scarce as the things that you're going to do with it. There's the reality that everything else in the world is scarce. Our houses are scarce, food, time, all these things are scarce. The only thing that it is not scarce, or one of the only things that affects everything else, is we have non-scarce money. And so again, waking up to that reality that we actually should have scarce money, and when you don't, it has all kinds of consequences. Waking up to that reality, it really has all kinds of downstream consequences. So.
Oh man.
So listen, we should talk about the conference though. We haven't even gotten there yet, and this is a big thing, right?
Yeah,
I think it's a big thing. I don't know if you think it is.
We hope so.
I want to try and come down to this thing.
How long have you been doing the conference, Jordan?
Yeah, so we've been doing the conference since 2022. We did the book came out in January 21. We did a prayer breakfast in Miami the day before the largest Bitcoin conference in the world. We did a prayer breakfast, and the crazy thing was I wasn't there for it, but Jimmy Song and some of these other guys were, and like we had Cynthia Lummis, who's a senator from the United States. She was running for senator at that time. She came. There were only 40 people there, and there were a comical amount of like well-known people. Warren Davidson, who's a U.S. congressman and a Christian, was there. Senator Lummis is a Christian. There's just like a number of Christian people who were well-known who wanted to be involved. So then in the next year, I was back in the States, and so Jimmy and some other folks reached out and just basically said, hey, we should do like a one-day conference in Miami and just invite people and you'll see, who wants to plan it. And so I come back and we were trying to figure out what we were going to do. And so I just said, hey, I can help with it. And so me and another guy helped coordinate it. And so we put it together, and we just had all kinds of, again, we had Blake Masters. Blake Masters he's running for Senate, I think in Arizona in the United States, Christian. He came. There's another guy named Jesse something who ran for governor of Illinois, who's the most overtly Christian politician I've ever seen in my entire life, like just incredibly vocal. And so then they said to us, they're like, hey, we want to bring a friend with us, and they're looking at us with like this thing of like they want us to ask who their friend is, and so we're like, okay, who's your friend? And they go, Tim Tebow. Do you guys know who Tim Tebow is?
No.
Okay. Tim Tebow is a
football
player.
We're Canadian, but we're not, on the main.
Okay. Well, I don't know. But yeah, so an American football player who's like a very outspoken Christian. So Tim came and then we had other people from the Bitcoin world who came. So we did this one-day event. It was a lot of fun, and people really appreciated it. And so in the aftermath, Jimmy and some of the other authors of the book, just basically that was kind of the impetus for them saying, hey, if you want to do this full time, like we'd be happy to fund you and give you the runway to be able to actually do this. So we've been doing it since then. So this will be our third year of the conference, and it's going to be in Nashville this year. We follow around. Again, the biggest Bitcoin conference every year is done by a company called Bitcoin Magazine, and their headquarters are in Nashville, and so they're going to be doing their conference in Nashville, and so we just decided, all right, we'll do it there too. We'll do ours there, and so we do ours actually the 2 days before. This is a bigger lift. We did 2 days last year. We're going to do 2 days this year, so we're doing that, and we're going to have a number of different pastors coming to speak. Basically, day one is going to be a Christian economics conference. Again, why should Christians care about these things? This is a very under talked about aspect, and so we really want to kind of unpack. We've lived in a world the last few years of crazy economic upheaval. People are more willing to ask questions and want to understand why and how some of these things are happening. And so we're going to do a Christian conference about economics, and then day two is going to be more explicitly Bitcoin related. We're going to talk about basically, if the first day is what does we want to look at economics through God's eyes. Day two will be what hath Bitcoin to do with Jerusalem? To quote that old that saying. I think was it Athanasius? Who was it who said that? Shoot, I can't think of who it is. But yeah, this phrase of what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? What do these two things have to do with each other? And the answer is they actually have a lot to do with each other. So we're gonna do that. And so you mentioned Jorg Guido Hulsmann, this Austrian economist, is going to come. We have a number of different people. There's one guy who's a farmer and regenerative agriculture guy, John Moody, is going to be coming. So lots of Christians, couple people who aren't Christians but who are Bitcoin people. Again, we want to kind of minister to and through everyone for the sake of the church, and so we want to just have people come out and help Christians provide a space where Christians can learn about these things and why they matter.
Yeah, really excited. We'll definitely link to that in the show notes, and so people can follow and hopefully book some tickets.
Yeah, that'd be great. We'd love to have you.
Yeah, July 24th and 25th, right?
Correct.
I'm just looking at the,
July 24th and 25th.
The thing now. So it's yeah, I know it's
you
really cool.
Time to read the book before
there you go. Yeah,
before the conference starts.
Well, I mean, yeah, the Bitcoin conferences. I haven't been to one, or not one of the big ones, but you always feel a little bit out of place. I don't know, as a Christian, right?
Yep.
Just a little bit like a fish out of water. So I think this is an awesome way to kind of, to preface the conference and look at stewardship and look at economics. I love that, the economics of glory.
Yeah,
it's such a cool.
You're referencing. So the title of the conference this year is "Render to God," and then it's stewardship, dominion, and the economics of glory. And so that's the economics of glory is this. It's this other book that I'm working on. It's going to be it's not going to be done quick, but it's more of like a look at just look at value from a biblical lens throughout the narrative of Scripture, and just looking at the heart of all value is basically the glory of God. Like, God's glory is the most valuable thing in the universe, and so just looking at and trying to think about basically glory is a currency, and so looking at and thinking about glory through that lens has been a really fruitful and helpful exercise for me. I've just been thinking about these things for about 5 years. And so just trying to, it's been incredibly helpful and fruitful. And so the goal is to kind of, both in this conference, unpack some of that, but then obviously with the book, do that in a more thorough way.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Are you, I don't know where you're going to church now, but are you Westminster Confession folks or?
Correct. Yeah, we have a couple. Okay. Yeah, we have a couple. I think we do. Yeah, Westminster and I think Heidelberg as well. We have a
we're Heidelberg Catechism. Yep. But I was just thinking of the first question, the Westminster Confession, right? What is the chief end of man? Man's 100%. Chief end is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. So
correct.
Yeah, give Him glory wherever we are, whatever we do.
Yeah, and again, the goal is to exhaustively do that, right? You have the, Dutch politician. There's not
Schilder?
One single inch over the entire creation of which Christ is not. What's the name?
Kuiper.
Abraham Kuiper. Goodness gracious. Yeah, Abraham Kuiper. So there's not 1 square inch over the entire creation over which God has not declared mine. And so that's kind of our goal, is just to help. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Doug Wilson, but Doug Wilson, he says all of Christ for all of life. Like that's literally what, when I think about this, we want to help the church see see God's lordship over everything, including money.
Yeah. No, I'm pumped up.
And including magic internet money, Bitcoin.
Yeah. All right, Brent, do you have any, we should probably wrap up, but do you have any final parting wisdom?
No, I don't. I think this has been really helpful, and I'm going to try and get down to this conference because I'll learn more and meet some of these excellent people.
Well, we'd love to have you, and I'm happy to give you guys like a special Two Stewards promo code. Maybe we'll do promo code Stewards. Do promo code Stewards, and then we'll get you. I don't know. We'll figure out a percentage that makes sense.
Well, I appreciate you doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Jordan, any, I don't know, is there anything we didn't cover that you wanted to cover, or where can people find you? I don't know, do you want people to find you?
Yeah, you can find us. I mean, you can find us at TGFB.com is our website. And then you can find me on Twitter is the easiest way. Just at, I'm sure you guys can put this in the show notes, but at JM Bush, BUSH, Writes, WRITES. Love to chat. Hit me up with a DM or, and then we'll go from there. Happy to help out in any way that we can. We have conversations all the time with Christian nonprofit organizations, Christian schools, churches who are trying to, think about like, what does it look like to actually have Bitcoin and hold Bitcoin? How do we do that? What are the legal ramifications around doing that? We do consulting. And then, even if we can't answer the questions, we have people entities, businesses who we can connect you to, who are doing that. And then we are trying to we're in the process of creating more formal, consulting things for nonprofits. And So again, yeah, happy to help out in any way that we can and shoot resources your way if this is something that it interests you and you're trying to figure out, okay, at the point where I want to take the next step, we're happy to help.
Awesome.
Yeah. Awesome. Jordan, thank you so much. This has been great. So
I appreciate you guys. Thank you guys for your time.
Yeah. Hope you guys got a lot out of it. Check Jordan out in any number of media. So until next time, folks,
steward your wealth wisely. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Two Stewards Show. If you like my voice better, click subscribe.
And if you like my voice better, click share.
If you like both, give us a 5-star rating.
To interact with the show, feel free to reach out at hello@twostewards.ca.
We'll see you in the next episode. In the meantime, steward your wealth wisely.